Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Banned Book Club, where we read like freedom depends on it. My name is Jenna, and this month's read was The Handmaid's Tale, and I'm really, really excited to talk about it and get into it with you guys today. This book is challenged in, I think it's 17 states. We'll get into that a little bit later, but we're going to talk a little bit about what the book is about, the censorship, the challenges, and why this story is still very, very important to speak about, especially in today's society where we are seeing a rollback of women's rights and women's bodily autonomy happen around the world. And we'll talk about the US and also other cases where we're seeing this happen, especially with the rise of religious nationalism that's happening pretty much everywhere today. I want to give a trigger warning that this book and this conversation will contain themes of sexual violence, loss of bodily autonomy. We're going to talk about the ceremony a little bit, which I'll get into later. And yeah, these are very, very heavy themes. So please proceed with caution to this next video. And as usual, while I'm talking about this book, I'm going to do an activity. I'm really excited because I'm going to Prague this week with one of my best friends. So while I'm talking, I'm going to kind of be packing, flying Ryanair. So everything's got to fit in this little bag. Luckily, I'm only there for 3 or 4 days. So hopefully, cross fingers, it won't be too hard, even though I'm a notorious overpacker. But yeah, I'll be kind of moving around, trying on different outfits and deciding exactly what I'm going to bring to Prague with me. So with all of that said, we'll jump right into it. Right. So The Handmaid's Tale was written in 1985 by Canadian author Margaret Atwood and takes place in the dystopian future society of Gilead, which, is meant to take place inside the US and was inspired by real life events that were happening all around the world at that time, but also specifically due to the rise of the alt-right Christian movement that came in a response to the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s that brought forth the birth control pill, allowed women to get their own credit cards, and the establishment of Roe versus Wade, which was a Supreme Court decision that established abortion as a reproductive health care right and protected women from criminal prosecution. We've seen in the last few years that that's turned away, and we'll talk about that later. The Society of Gilead, it's an oppressive society based on Christian and patriarchal ideas that essentially places women in different roles and classes, but all within the position of servitude, whether it's domestic or sexual. Offred, the main character, who is a handmaid, she is in the role of sexual servitude, where women are not all fertile, and so they put fertile women in that position to have sex with high-ranking officials and essentially, forces them to have babies and then provide them to the commander and their wife. So we can see different elements of this society happening kind of around the world today. And that, I think, is why it's so important that this story remains at the forefront of conversations. We'll talk about that a little bit more once we start discussing the ban, the challenges, and the reasons that people are pushing for censorship of this story. In the story, Offred navigates this oppressive world through small and larger acts of resistance, such as, hiding butter, hiding matches in order to get some element of control. She puts butter in her sock because women are, not allowed to have lotions, skincare, anything like that. It's viewed as vanity and it's pushed away. Women are not allowed to smoke, drink. She's provided in a clandestine way a cigarette and a match. And instead of doing that, she hides the match with the idea that, she has the control to light everything on fire. Whether she does or not, I'm not going to say. But all of these are small acts of resistance that she does in order to hold her own autonomy in this society. Surveillance is also a huge part of this society. They have eyes and spies pretty much everywhere, and nobody knows exactly who these eyes and spies are. They are people that work for the regime, the totalitarian regime in Gilead, and they can report you any moment. And if you're reported, you are sent away to an island and forced to clean nuclear waste, and or eventually you will decay and die. So it's a very, very extreme case, and people and the women in the society are doing everything they can to not end up in this position, in the hope that at one point society will return back to a normal place. We see kind of through her fragmented and reflective memories how the society unfolds. She thinks and refers to times when she was let go of her job because she was a woman. She was lost access to her credit card, And then even towards the end, before she was taken to the center, when her daughter and her husband were forcibly separated from her. And she doesn't know at this point where her daughter is or if her husband is still alive. She has reflections to memories being in university with her best friend, the abilities to kind of think, perceive, and now in a society where women are not even allowed to read or write, that is considered illegal. And pretty much her entire role, as I mentioned, is to be a reproductive slave, and she's in reproductive servitude throughout this entire story. So we see her struggling to survive and the different coping ways that she does this. We see how she tries to resist. We see how she tries to, maintain and keep moving forward and adjust to this element of distrust that exists around her. I guess now I picked an outfit that kind of looks a lot like the cover of The Handmaid's Tale. Hopefully this will be good for a day out, a night out. It's pretty universal. But now we're going to talk about the censorship and the reason for that the book has been challenged across the different states. So there have been challenges on the right, the conservative side, and also on the left, the progressive side. We're going to start by talking about the conservative side. It has been challenged in a number of states, most recently Idaho in 2025, and this has to do with the anti-religious themes that talk about feminism, that are, against men, against the patriarchy. This might be hurtful to people, and also for their portrayal of sex and the vulgarity and harsh language that is associated with sex in context of like the ceremony and other examples throughout the book. I think it's very harmful to connotate and build a relationship between the idea that the ceremony has anything to do with sex. As I've mentioned, these women are in reproductive servitude. They're pretty much sexual slaves. There's no element of consent to it. So using language that is harsh, maybe vulgar, and, very, very descriptive of the fact that this is not an experience that these women are meant to enjoy is actually essential in order to convey the element of horror that exists within these situations. In terms of the progressive side and the progressive challenges, it has been challenged in states like Massachusetts, California, New York, and Illinois, because these are very traumatic and heavy themes, and the school boards and libraries are not, and parents for that matter, are not sure if their child should be exposed to these themes that are triggering, traumatic, and very, very heavy. So on both sides, there's concerns about how young people are going to accept these stories, how they're going to interpret these stories, and if these uncomfortable stories are really, really important. I think maybe if you listen to my last episode when I speak with the American English teacher, Kristen, we talk about the importance of having uncomfortable stories in classrooms, in safe places where students are allowed to process these things with safe facilitators such as educators, and also with peers who may relate to it, and it kind of builds on these anti-isolation themes. Lots of women have experienced things like sexual assault. These stories of, lack of bodily autonomy are very timely and timeless issues, and we need to continue to understand when, how, and where these things have happened to prevent it from happening again in the future. I personally think that these stories, of course, should not be censored. They should not be banned in schools, because we're limiting the ability to understand and protect ourselves from these things happening again. So now we're going to deep dive into some of the real life aspects that shaped this story. As I mentioned, Margaret Atwood based these stories on real life events that were happening in the US as well as around the world, and from the past and the present, to build this future society where women become a subclass group of humans and are completely controlled by the patriarchal and religious ideals. So we can take this all the way back to the Puritans in New England, who actually fled England to Plymouth Rock in order to create a more religious society. Dancing was banned, women were isolated from schools, abortion definitely did not exist in a legal capacity at that time, and women were forced to be domestic, forced to kind of serve the men, stay at home, raise the children, and women that did not align with these values were burned at the stake for being witches. This kind of speaks as well to that element of surveillance that happens in this Gilead society, when there's the eyes and the people that are always watching them, such as even the doctors, even other handmaids, people that work within the centers, and it creates that element of distrust. In the New England Puritan society, women were turned on by their neighbors, by their friends, by people in their community when they had an asset of something that they wanted, whether it was owning land, whether it was being educated, whether it was having medical knowledge. They were considered witches and then therefore burned at the stake. We can also see this reproductive control happening in places like Romania under Ceausescu's dictatorship, where the state monitored fertility, monitored pregnancies, and fertility was seen as an asset to the state. We can see this happening in places like El Salvador and Guatemala that have some of the harshest anti-abortion laws in the entire world. Women are not allowed to have an abortion, even if the fetus is not viable, even if they have had a miscarriage, even if it's a risk to the life of the mother. It doesn't matter. Abortion is banned, and there are definitely cases of women that have been imprisoned because of having these necessary services that would even save their own life. We can also see this on the other side of it with forced sterilization. Bell versus Buck was a landmark Supreme Court case that upheld a Virginia statute that said that forced sterilization of women, such as Indigenous women, women of color, disabled women, it actually was a good thing, and it protected the future of the United States and the future of what society should look like. So even as most recent is 1920 in the United States, things like that were really upheld. And you can see this in the way more recent context in prisons from 2006 to 2011 in California, where women were forcefully sterilized within the prison, either after giving birth, going in for other procedures, and they were not informed at all or even properly of how this was happening, and oftentimes found out later when going in for another procedure, finding out that they couldn't give birth, only to find out that this happened. And the doctors within these prisons were actually held liable in a lawsuit that this was happening, that this wasn't just in their imagination, this was a real context that had happened in the 21st century. We can also see the forced sterilization happening with Indigenous women in the US, as I mentioned in the case of Bell versus Buck, in places like Peru, in places like Greenland. So these themes are very, very real, very, very recent, and only just now are getting the restitution that they deserve and the awareness that they deserve. In my interview, I'm really excited to talk to a public historian who has a wealth of knowledge about this topic. So we'll be diving into forced sterilization a little bit more in that episode with her. But all of these different elements reflect a key theme of women being controlled in a male-dominated society through surveillance and through reproductive autonomy, or lack of reproductive autonomy, I should say. There are real-life examples of this happening as well in theocracies. One of the most common theocracies that we can think of is in Afghanistan, where women are barred from education, from many places of work. For example, they're not allowed to work for the UN. Women that are coming and going from work are often harassed by the government and their de facto regime's militia and the Taliban. They're barred from going to places like beauty salons where other women can gather, share ideas, kind of furthering this idea of surveillance and isolation. And they're banned from leaving the house without a male companion. And this is all under the guise of religion, what religion is supposed to uphold. And while this is one example that connects with Islam, this by no means speaks to that religion specifically. A lot of what we're talking about today has to do with the larger picture of religious extremism in the government. We can see this with the Hinduvista movement within India, the rise of Hindu nationalism. We can see this in the occupied territory of Palestine, where Zionism is used to justify a genocide and has been used to justify a genocide for more than 75 years. And we can see this with the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States and how Donald Trump and his government use Christian ideals to not only bring people together, but also further isolate people that don't necessarily align with those ideas. We can see this as well with the overturn of Roe versus Wade and how many of these states that have a higher percentage of religious citizens, people that reside within that state, they use religion as an excuse to overturn Roe versus Wade and put in some pretty strict and horrible abortion laws that penalize women after 6 weeks. Some don't allow abortion at all. The biggest one I can think of right now is in Tennessee, where they're trying to put forward that women who get an abortion, are eligible to go to prison for life under the charge of killing a preborn child, I think, as it says. So this is happening in very, very real ways right in front of us under the guise of religion in lots and lots of places in the world. It's not only in the past in Romania, in El Salvador, or even in the more recent past, like the California prisons. This is happening in today's day and age. And there are more and more people that are buying into this rhetoric, which is part of what makes it so, so important that we keep this story alive and we keep it at the center of these conversations. These types of stories present the idea that these things that happen in Gilead are not so far off. They are already happening, and they can happen. And as different countries, as different parties, as different religions start to adopt more of these ideas and these rhetoric, it further empowers other religious theocracies, other religious extremists, other people that are anti-feminism to push and adopt these different practices because other people are doing it, so it further influences that mindset. When religions start shaping laws and then laws start reflecting religion, we lose that separation from church and state, or mosque and state, or however you want to say that. In France, they use the term la laïcité, and that idea is being further and further driven apart as these different religious extremists and conservative movements begin to take power globally. So I'll be honest, when I was reading this book, there were lots and lots of places where I thought, oh my gosh, this is quite slow. This is not much is happening. She's in the center. She's out of the center. She's back in the center. She's walking. It's really, a lot of it is just in her own brain, in her own reflection. And it made it kind of slow and drag on at times. But the more and more and more that I considered this, the more that I kind of built this bridge between this story and a lot of these other stories that reflect the feminine identity in a male-dominated society. So you can see this, for example, in Sofia Coppola movies and things like Marie Antoinette or Priscilla, where women are really, once they get married, they're isolated into the house. They have to just go along with what the husband wants, what the king wants. We can see this in stories like The Bell Jar or stories by Anne Sexton, where women, even if they're part of this upper-class society and they appear to have all the comforts that they need around them, mentally they're suffering and mentally that they're struggling. And that is exactly the case with Offred. I mean, she's definitely not in this upper-class society. As I mentioned, she's relegated to the role of a reproductive slave. However, she is technically in a home. She's not in this island cleaning up reproductive waste. She's not in the role of a prostitute. And she is supposedly, in the eyes of this society, in a very respectable position because she gets to be pregnant. She gets to carry the child, even though, she had her own child that was forcibly taken from her in order for her to fulfill this role. It doesn't stop them from trying to condition that mindset that what she's doing is honorable, it's necessary, and it's to protect women and to protect the society and allow it to develop. One of the characters that I found the most compelling in the story was Serena Joy. She is the wife of Offred's commander, and she can be related to people in society today like Erica Kirk or even Candace Owens that speak out adamantly about anti-feminist themes, that feminism is bad for women, despite being people that benefit significantly from feminism in the modern day society. They're both business women, they both have a platform, they both have homes, credit cards, and they are allowed to choose how they interact with this society. Both of these women use religion and the religious values that they have as tools and methods for encouraging other women to go into these domestic roles, and it's part of this coercive kind of grooming, brainwashing element, for lack of a better word. And we see this with Serena Joy, who was one of these spokespersons in the pre-Gilead society. And once Gilead became actualized, she was put in the position of a wife, which is higher than a Martha, higher than a handmaid. However, she's bored. Her only role is supporting the commander, and you can see in the story how much she suffers in this role. And Offred, and I even find it quite ironic, because she's in the society that she was preaching for towards other people, but once it's reflected on her, she maybe has a reflection of how miserable this actual society is when you're living under a patriarchy, specifically one dominated by religion. In the story, we see, all these things being actualized, religion being used as control, the loss of identity as part of that manipulation, grooming, brainwashing element. It's meant to separate the handmaids and the people in servitude from their past, where they had autonomy, they had rights, they had a job and credit cards, and it's forced to make them kind of question who they were before and where they are now and create this massive gap. It also speaks to the complicity that people have with characters like Serena Joy, who actively acted to support this movement and this regime, and also in situations like the salvaging, where the handmaids are forced to be involved in an execution process where they execute people for providing abortions or allegedly committing rape. In one of the cases, we don't know if he actually committed rape, but he was executed nonetheless. And the handmaids being brought in as a part of that further draw them into this world where they become an actor in it and not just an observer and victim. As I said at the beginning, Offred is able to survive with small acts of resistance that eventually lead to larger acts of resistance. Things like putting the butter in her socks so she can use it as lotion is a small act of resistance. Things like taking the match and putting it in her mattress so she can use it later is a small act of resistance. And this eventually leads to larger acts of resistance, are sanctioned by higher members of the society, such as the commander, such as the wife, and she further enables that and further takes it to another level of her own autonomy, but she doesn't necessarily have the autonomy to do that on her own, and she has to rely on people that are in higher positions of power to allow her to engage in this type of clandestine behavior. You see her using her memories as well as an act of resistance, trying to, remember what it was like with her child, remember what it was like with her husband. In situations like the ceremony, she thinks a lot about her husband, what it meant to be intimate with someone before it was forced, and kind of balances these two realities in a way to remind herself that this is not everything. This is not what she is used to, and that is how she can keep her identity and her presence alive. And I think we see that a lot in other stories about women, in Persepolis, for example, as the Islamic regime began to take over in Iran during the Islamic Revolution in the 1970s, she begins to, the protagonist, begins to engage with the music and the art that is banned in the country and stands up actively to speak out against it because she wants to hold on to that identity. She's not ready to let it go, even going so far as to take off her hijab when she's around some of the government and the politicians that are there. So we see how as autonomy gets revoked, we can see the different aspects that people do in stories and in The Handmaid's Tale to maintain that independence. Reading and writing is banned for women in this Gilead society. She's not able to access any books, any magazines, hear the news, or anything like that. So the way that she does that is by reading things like notes that are on the pillows, reading small little phrases that are on decoration around the house, and those are active ways that she resists this brainwashing to avoid becoming completely complicit to the society that's in front of her and that she's being forced into. Why does this story still matter? As I mentioned, this reflects the past, this reflects things happening in the present, and this reflects a potential future that could emerge as we see the rise of all of these different beliefs, theocracies, alt-right extremism, and we see women's bodily autonomy being revoked in places in the US in a very inequitable way as well. It's important to remember that these things don't just happen overnight. This happens after careful, meticulous, and intentional conditioning. I was even reading a report by the Home Office about radicalization that happens online and today. And this report was from 2025, and they said that of all of the different mindset material or ideological material that's put out there, misogyny existed in 100% of the examples, and we can see that as well with the rise of the trad wife influencers and being in my feminine era. All of these language and all of these tools are ways that society now and the politics now are trying to condition women to become complacent to what is happening around them. And it's more important than ever that we keep these stories in the conversation. We keep people talking about it. We encourage people even to share their own experiences about what's happened to them when they've lost bodily autonomy. And we keep focusing on the different stories of this happening, such as the woman in Georgia that was brain dead and she was forced to carry that baby inside of her because they couldn't provide an abortion on her. So she was forced to give birth to this child before they took her off of life support, which is honestly one of the most inhumane things that I have heard in recent time. But that is just a real life example today of how these things can really happen. And I don't think we're that far off from that happening on a larger scale in places like the US. This story, I think, also is a good reminder and warning of how easy it becomes to accept this type of control, to accept what is happening, men and women alike. We see this again with the trad wife movement that's happening online. It positions feminism and all these things as hurting women. Women should be in their feminine era. They should stay at home. Motherhood is the best thing ever. And maybe motherhood is the best thing ever. I'm not trying to critique that, but I'm just saying that feminism is all about having the point and the perspective and the right to make these choices. Roe versus Wade is not encouraging people to get abortion. It's allowing women to have the choice about their future, about their lives. And it's also protecting the future children that, deserve to come into a family and a home and in a place where they're wanted, they're supported, and they're encouraged. And with all of these movements to push against that, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, with all this state legislation that is countering that, it definitely makes it easier and encourages people to accept things that are not right. And I hope that people who read The Handmaid's Tale can take pieces of it and take pieces from this video and look more critically at what's happening around us to understand that we are already being conditioned to enter a society that is controlled by theocracy and patriarchy, if you don't think we're already there. So Gilead is not a warning about one type of society and one type of theocracy or about Christianity or anything like that. It is a reminder and a warning about how power, belief, and control stop being questioned, and it is a reflection on the past histories of the women that have suffered as a result of that. So I'd like to close this episode with one of Offred's final quotes from the story, where she says, "So I step up, either into the darkness within or to the light." I think it's important to remember that, especially, right now. The patriarchy isn't going away. The best thing that we can do for the patriarchy is to be quiet and stop talking about this. And, at a time when our rights are being violated, our sisters, our mothers, and our neighbors' rights are being violated and controlled through restrictions to do with autonomy or surveillance through things like ICE in the US, we have no choice but to try to step forward and protect each other, protect ourselves, and continue to engage with this literature and these conversations. Thank you so much to everybody for joining me for this episode. Sorry if it seemed a little chaotic. I've had to try to record this now about 4 times, so if it seems a little broken, please bear with me on that. I look forward to seeing everyone next month while we read The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini that speaks about 2 boys growing up in Afghanistan, feelings of guilt, and just a very, very timely topic in the regime that I had mentioned earlier under the Taliban's control, and for people fleeing war and kind of the different internal conflicts and traumas that come from that in a lot of different ways. So thank you guys so much for being with me. I will be sharing out details about this book and sharing an interview that I'm going to be discussing with the public historian next week. So yeah, thank you so much for engaging with the Banned Book Club. Let's keep reading like freedom depends on it, because it does.